The Whispering Hall. Michael Lane was a painter, though he hadn't sold a piece in months. His talent was undeniable, but the market was fickle, and inspiration had abandoned him. So when he stumbled upon the listing for an old mansion outside of town, its rent shockingly cheap, he ignored the warning bells clanging in his head. A change of scenery might be what I need, he told himself. The house, a sprawling, decrepit structure half swallowed by ivy, loomed like a forgotten relic of another time. Its windows were dark, its paint peeling, and its roof sagged in places. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Harris, handed Michael the keys without ceremony. "Keep to yourself," he said, his voice low. "The place has a history." Michael dismissed the comment with a nervous laugh, eager to settle in. The house's interior was as worn as its exterior, dusty furniture, faded wallpaper, and a musty scent that clung to every corner. But there was charm in its decay, and Michael set up his easel in the grand hall, a cavernous room with high ceilings and dark wood paneling. The first night, he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves. It came from the walls. Michael froze, his brush suspended mid-stroke. "Just the wind," he muttered. But the whispering continued, growing louder, threading through the silence like a persistent thread. "Michael." He spun around, his heart hammering. The room was empty. He pressed his ear to the wall, and the whispering stopped. Swallowing his unease, he returned to his painting, convincing himself it was his imagination. But the whispers returned every night, growing bolder. They spoke in fragmented sentences, voices overlapping like a chaotic chorus. She knew. Betrayal. Don't trust him. Michael tried to drown them out, blasting music and working feverishly on his art. Strangely, his creativity surged. His brush moved as if guided by an unseen hand, and his canvases filled with haunting, evocative scenes, dark forests, crumbling ruins, and shadowy figures that seemed to stare back at him. One morning, as he examined his latest piece, he noticed something chilling. The background of the painting depicted the grand hall, and in the shadows stood a figure, tall, faceless, and watching. Michael shivered and shoved the painting aside, chalking it up to coincidence. But the figure appeared in every subsequent painting. Always in the background, always watching. Desperate for answers, Michael confronted Mr. Harris. The old man's face paled when Michael described the whispers. "You should have left the moment you heard them," Harris said. "This house, it's hungry. It feeds on secrets, draws them out like poison. The walls, they know things. Things you've buried. Things you've forgotten." Michael laughed, though it sounded hollow. "That's ridiculous." But Harris only shook his head. "It's not me you need to convince." That night, Michael couldn't sleep. The whispers were deafening now, a torrent of accusations and confessions. They spoke of his failures, his guilt, the bridges he'd burned in pursuit of his art. And then they spoke of her. Emma. Her name was a dagger. Emma, his muse, his lover, the woman he had driven away with his selfishness. He hadn't thought of her in years, hadn't let himself. But the whispers dragged her memories to the surface, vivid and raw. "You let her go. You loved your art more." Michael clamped his hands over his ears, but it was useless. The walls pulsed with the voices, vibrating with an energy that made the room feel alive. And then he saw it. The figure from his paintings, emerging from the shadows, its faceless head tilting as if to steady him. Michael stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure reached out, its hand impossibly long, its fingers curling toward him. With a scream, Michael fled the house, leaving behind his supplies, his paintings, and his sanity. He never returned, and the house remains empty to this day, its windows dark and its walls whispering to no one. Some say the mansion still hungers, waiting for its next tenant. Others claim they've seen Michael's paintings, haunting masterpieces, and galleries far from town, each one bearing the shadowy figure that now haunts him forever. The Faceless Watcher. James Holloway wasn't one for antiques. He preferred the clean, modern lines of contemporary furniture, but something about the mirror caught his eye. It was tucked away in the corner of a dusty shop he'd wandered into on a whim. Its frame, a twisting riot of vines and thorns carved from dark wood, seemed almost alive in the dim light. The glass itself was murky, as though it had forgotten how to reflect the world properly. "That one special," the shopkeeper said, his voice raspy and low, "came from an old estate. There's a story behind it, if you care to hear." James smiled politely but shook his head. Stories were for other people. He bought the mirror, the price oddly low for something so intricate, and had it delivered to his apartment. He hung it in his bedroom, directly across from his bed. That night, he regretted it. At first, it was nothing more than a feeling, an uneasy sensation that he was being watched. He brushed it off as the mirror's size and placement making the room feel different. But when he looked into it, he felt a chill run down his spine. His reflection was there, of course, but the rest of the room seemed darker in the glass, the shadows deeper and more menacing. It wasn't until the third night that he saw it. He'd been lying in bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling. When he turned his head toward the mirror, he froze. A figure stood behind him. Tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow, its presence loomed large in the reflection. Its face, if it had one, was a blank void, a smooth, featureless expanse that seemed to draw the light out of the room. James whipped around, heart pounding. The space behind him was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a product of his overactive imagination. But each night, the figure returned, always standing just behind him in the reflection, always faceless. He tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but it did little to ease his dread. The sense of being watched persisted, seeping into his days, making him jumpy and paranoid. Desperate, James returned to the antique shop. The shopkeeper greeted him with a knowing look. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the old man asked. James hesitated, then nodded. "What is it? Why is it happening?" The shopkeeper sighed, his expression somber. "The mirror, it doesn't just reflect what's in front of it. It reflects what's been. What's still there, if you look close enough." James frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It's not meant to," the man replied. "Some objects carry a history. The mirror, it's a window to something we're not supposed to see. Whatever stands behind you in that glass, it's tied to the house it came from. And now, it's tied to you. How do I get rid of it?" James's voice was barely a whisper. "You can't," the shopkeeper said, his tone flat. "Not without consequences." James left the shop, the shopkeeper's words circling in his mind. He decided to sell the mirror, placing an ad online and pricing it low enough to ensure a quick sale. A young couple came to pick it up the next day, their excitement palpable. As they carried the mirror out, James felt a pang of guilt. But relief washed over him once it was gone. That night, he slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But in the morning, when he glanced into the bathroom mirror, his heart stopped. The faceless figure stood behind him again, its presence as oppressive as ever. It hadn't been tied to the mirror after all. It had been tied to him. The child beneath the bed. It began one quiet evening, as the house lay wrapped in the soft cloak of twilight. Clara sat in the living room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, while her daughter, Lily, played upstairs in her room. The house was old, its bones creaking in the stillness, but Clara had never minded the occasional groan of the floorboards or the whisper of the wind through the drafty windows. It was part of the house's charm, she'd always said. But that night, the sound was different. Laughter. High, sweet, and unmistakably that of a child. Clara paused, her fingers tightening around the yarn. At first, she smiled, thinking Lily must be entertaining herself with some imaginary game. But the sound came again, drifting down the staircase, a laugh, clear and light as a bell. And it wasn't Lily's. "Lily?" Clara called, setting her knitting aside and rising to her feet. "Yes, Mama," came Lily's reply, muffled and distant. Clara climbed the stairs, the laughter growing fainter with each step. She entered Lily's room to find her daughter seated on the bed, a book open in her lap. Her dark curls framed her face, and her wide eyes blinked up at her mother with innocent curiosity. "Who are you talking to?" Clara asked, glancing around the room. It was as it always was, a jumble of stuffed animals, a few scattered toys, and the faint smell of lavender from the sachets Clara kept in the closet. Lily frowned. "No one. I'm reading." Clara hesitated. "I heard laughter. It sounded like a little girl." Lily's expression didn't change. "I didn't hear anything." Clara nodded, forcing a smile. Perhaps she had imagined it. But the laughter came again the next night. And the night after that. Always the same, soft, musical, and undeniably real. Clara began to dread the sound, her unease growing with each passing day. She searched the house, even crawling under Lily's bed to prove to herself that nothing was there. And yet, each time she looked into the shadowy space, she felt the fine hairs on her neck rise, as though something unseen watched her. One evening, as Clara tucked Lily into bed, she sat on the edge of the mattress and stroked her daughter's hair. "Sweetheart, you would tell me if there was someone else here, wouldn't you?" Lily's brow furrowed. "Of course, Mama. But there isn't anyone." Clara forced a laugh. "Silly of me to ask." "Good night, darling." Lily smiled, her eyes drifting closed. "Good night." Clara lingered for a moment, watching her daughter's peaceful face. But as she turned to leave, she heard it, the laughter, soft and close. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was coming from beneath the bed. Slowly, her hands trembling, Clara knelt and lifted the edge of the bedspread. The darkness beneath seemed deeper than it should have been, as though the shadows had grown thick and heavy. For a moment, she saw nothing. And then, two small, glinting eyes blinked back at her. Clara jerked back, stifling a scream. She grabbed Lily, who stirred sleepily in her arms, and fled the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, they slept in the living room, Clara clutching her daughter tightly. But the laughter didn't stop. It echoed through the house, now louder, now softer, a mocking refrain that refused to be silenced. The next day, Clara sought help. A priest blessed the house, sprinkling holy water in every room. A medium walked through the halls, murmuring incantations and claiming to feel a restless presence. But the laughter persisted, growing bolder with each passing night. Finally, Clara made the decision she had been dreading. She and Lily packed their belongings and left the house behind. As they drove away, Clara glanced in the rearview mirror and felt a chill crawl down her spine. For just a moment, she thought she saw a small figure standing in the upstairs window, watching them go. They never returned to the house. But sometimes, late at night, as Clara lies awake in their new apartment, she thinks she hears it again, the soft, sweet laughter of a child, just beneath the bed. The Clockmaker's Curse. When Adrian's grandfather passed away, the inheritance was modest, a few faded photographs, a collection of leather-bound books, and an ancient clock. The clock, tall and imposing, stood nearly 7 feet high with a face that seemed to glower at whoever dared to meet its gaze. It had always been the centerpiece of his grandfather's study, ticking away with a resonance that could be felt in one's bones. Adrian remembered staring at it as a child, wondering why it seemed to pulse with an almost human presence. The clock arrived at Adrian's apartment a week after the funeral, delivered with a handwritten note, "Keep it wound. Never let it stop." The note was unsigned, but unmistakably written in his grandfather's meticulous hand. Adrian turned the paper over, searching for an explanation, but there was nothing more. With a shrug, he placed the clock in the corner of his living room and went about his day. That first night, the clock's ticking was louder than he remembered, a steady, relentless beat that seemed to echo in his skull. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, but as the hours wore on, the sound grew heavier, as if each tick carried a weight he couldn't define. At precisely midnight, the clock chimed. Adrian, half asleep on the couch, bolted upright. The chime was deep and resonant, shaking the walls and vibrating through the floor. He stared at the clock, heart pounding. The pendulum swung rhythmically, but for a brief moment, Adrian thought he saw something move within the glass. A shadow? A flicker of light? He wasn't sure. "It's just a clock," he muttered to himself, but even as he said it, the unease lingered. The next day, Adrian examined the clock more closely. The wood was dark and intricately carved, the kind of craftsmanship no longer seen in modern times. The face was unusual, its numbers written in a script Adrian couldn't recognize. But what struck him most was the second hand. It moved backward. He frowned, tapping the glass. The hand continued its reverse journey, ticking steadily. Adrian felt a chill creep up his spine. Something about the motion seemed wrong, as if the clock were unraveling time itself. Over the following days, strange things began to happen. The ticking grew louder, a ceaseless rhythm that drowned out his thoughts. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and at night, whispers filled the silence, low and unintelligible, but undeniably real. Adrian started sleeping with the lights on, though it did little to ease his growing paranoia. One evening, as he sat staring at the clock, he noticed the countdown. A small, unobtrusive dial near the bottom marked the days, hours, and minutes. It was only then he realized the truth. The clock wasn't just marking time, it was counting down. To what, he couldn't say, but the numbers ticked away with grim determination. Adrian tried to stop the clock. He opened the glass and reached for the pendulum, but the moment his hand touched the brass, he felt a searing pain shoot through his arm. He recoiled, clutching his hand, and watched as the pendulum continued its relentless swing, untouched. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking him. Desperate, Adrian called a clockmaker, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a hesitant smile. The man examined the clock, his expression darkening as he ran his fingers over the carvings. "This is no ordinary clock," the clockmaker murmured. "It's cursed." Adrian laughed nervously. "Cursed? Come on. It's just an old clock." The clockmaker shook his head. "I've seen one like this before. They're rare, made by a man known as the clockmaker. He believed time was a living force, something to be harnessed and controlled. But his creations, they're dangerous. They take more than they give." Adrian's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" The clockmaker hesitated. "If it's counting down, it's counting to something. And when it reaches zero," he trailed off, his gaze shifting to the clock, where the countdown continued unerringly. That night, Adrian dreamed of his grandfather. In the dream, the old man stood beside the clock, his face gaunt and shadowed. "I'm sorry," his grandfather said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I could control it. But it's stronger than me. Than you. Don't let it stop. Whatever happens, don't let it stop." Adrian woke with a start, his chest heaving. The clock loomed in the corner, its ticking now a deafening roar. He stumbled out of bed, gripping his head as the whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't understand. The countdown was almost at zero. With trembling hands, Adrian grabbed a hammer and swung it at the clock. The glass shattered, shards flying in every direction, but the pendulum didn't stop. The numbers on the countdown spun faster and faster, the hands of the clock whirling in a frenzy. The room darkened, and Adrian felt the air grow heavy, suffocating. When the clock struck zero, the world seemed to shatter. A deafening silence fell, and Adrian was plunged into darkness. Days later, a neighbor entered Adrian's apartment, concerned by his absence. The living room was empty, save for the clock, which stood pristine and silent in the corner. The countdown had reset, its dial marking the days, hours, and minutes once more. The neighbor didn't notice the faint outline of a figure reflected in the glass, a shadow that looked eerily like Adrian, staring back with hollow eyes. A small, dimly lit sewing shop with an eerie atmosphere, filled with shelves lined with dolls in various states of disrepair. The air is thick with dust, and the soft glow of an old lamp illuminates a wooden desk cluttered with sewing supplies, needles, threads, fabric scraps. In the center, a seamstress, a middle-aged woman with short, messy hair, is focused on repairing a porcelain doll with a cracked face and glassy, lifeless eyes. The dolls on the shelves seem to watch her, their expressions almost human. The room feels quiet but heavy, as though something unnatural is present. There's a faint glow around the dolls, suggesting an ominous, supernatural energy. The atmosphere is tense and mysterious, with a sense of impending doom. Style, dark, moody, and atmospheric, with a touch of horror and suspense. The image should capture a sense of unease and isolation, with subtle supernatural undertones. The ghosts of the library. Elliot had always been drawn to books, their quiet presence offering comfort in a world that often seemed too loud. So, when he was offered a job as a night librarian at Hawthorne University, an old, prestigious institution with a reputation for its vast library, he felt like he had stepped into a dream. The library itself was a massive, Gothic building, full of towering shelves that seemed to stretch into eternity. The high, arched windows let in just enough moonlight to cast long, eerie shadows across the worn wooden floors. There was a stillness here, a kind of heavy silence, that felt as though the building itself was holding its breath. On his first night, Elliot settled into the small, dimly lit office tucked away at the back of the library. He had been told it was a quiet shift, mostly routine. The library closed at midnight, and his job was to make sure everything was in order and that no one wandered the halls after hours. It seemed like a peaceful enough job. But as the hours stretched on, Elliot began to feel something strange in the air, an odd heaviness that seemed to seep into the very walls of the library. It was around 2 in the morning when he first noticed the door. He had walked past it dozens of times, a small wooden door in the far corner of the library, always locked. He had never thought much of it, but tonight, something was different. The door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him. Elliot pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air in the basement smelled of mildew and old dust. He hesitated for a moment, but then descended the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. At the bottom, the basement opened into a large, low-ceilinged room filled with shelves of ancient, leather-bound books. There were books that hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. Some had cobwebs clinging to them, others were covered in dust so thick that their titles were unreadable. Elliot felt a strange pull toward one of the bookshelves. As he reached out to touch one of the books, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was something unsettling about this place, something beyond the usual silence of old libraries. He pulled a book from the shelf, its pages yellowed with age. The title was worn away, but the weight of it felt significant. He opened it, and the words inside seemed to twist and writhe on the page. As he read, the room around him began to shift. At first, it was a faint whisper, something he could almost ignore. But then it grew louder, like a chorus of voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Elliot shivered. He turned his eyes back to the pages, but now the words had begun to blur, becoming unreadable, as though the book itself was alive, shifting to hide its secrets from him. Suddenly, he was not alone. Figures appeared in the corners of his vision, moving silently, their faces blurred, as though they were caught in the half-light between two worlds. He could hear their footsteps, slow, deliberate, like they were walking through the very walls of the library. He looked up and saw one of them standing in front of him, a young woman, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets, as if her very soul had been sucked out of her. She reached out with a skeletal hand and whispered, "We were forgotten." Before Elliot could react, the figure vanished, leaving only the echo of her voice hanging in the air. His heart was racing, his breath shallow. He turned back to the book, desperate to make sense of what was happening. But the more he read, the more the voices grew louder, more insistent. Each ghost that appeared told a different story, stories of students who had disappeared without a trace, students who had come to the university seeking knowledge, but had found only death in these very halls. As the night wore on, Elliot became trapped in the book's dark history, each page revealing more about the sinister force that had haunted the university for generations. The ghosts were not just spirits, they were warnings, each one a piece of a puzzle that Elliot was now determined to solve. But the more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the force that had claimed these lives was still here, in the very walls of the library, waiting for its next victim. Elliot tried to leave, but the basement door was now locked. The ghosts surrounded him, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. He was not just reading about them, he was becoming part of their story. In the end, Elliot was never seen again. The library remained as it always had, silent and watchful. The only sign of his presence was the book he had been reading, left open on the desk in the basement, its pages now filled with new words, new stories. And every so often, if you listened closely enough, you might hear the faintest of whispers, as if the library itself was trying to tell you something, to warn you. But no one ever paid attention. The Watcher in the Woods. The cabin was everything Lily and her family had dreamed of. A small, weathered building tucked away in the heart of the woods, far from the noise of city life. For months, they had imagined this retreat, a quiet escape from the constant hum of their everyday lives, a place to reconnect with nature and with each other. They arrived with high hopes, and for the first few days, everything felt perfect. The air was clean, the trees were tall and comforting, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was on the fourth night that Lily first saw it. At dusk, as she was sitting on the porch, her eyes caught a movement on the edge of the woods. Just at the line where the trees began, she saw a figure, tall, dark, and unmoving. It stood at the edge of the shadows, too far to make out any details, but she could feel it watching her. Her first instinct was to dismiss it. It was probably just a trick of the light, she thought, or perhaps an animal standing still. But when she looked again, it was still there. She quickly turned back to the inside of the cabin, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Surely, it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks. Yet, every time she glanced toward the woods, she could feel that presence, like eyes boring into her. It was always there, always at the edge of the trees, never moving any closer, but never leaving either. She didn't say anything to her husband, Mark. He was already so busy with the cabin's repairs, and she didn't want to worry him with something as ridiculous as a figure in the woods. But every night, it was there. Just standing, still, at the same spot. Always watching. Sometimes, when she tried to look at it more closely, it seemed to vanish, as if it was never there at all, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined it. But Lily knew what she had seen. She wasn't sure how, but deep down, she could feel it. The figure was not normal. There was something wrong about it, something inhuman. Its shape was too rigid, too deliberate, like it was aware of its own unnatural stillness. She began to notice little things, the way the birds stopped singing at dusk, the way the wind would suddenly still when she glanced at the woods. At night, she could hear the distant crack of branches, as if someone, or something, was moving just out of sight. But whenever she tried to search for it, the figure was gone. She began to feel like she was losing her mind. Her thoughts turned in circles, her body on edge, like she was constantly being watched. She told herself that it was just the isolation, the silence of the cabin getting to her. But the figure never went away. It lingered, always there, always waiting. One evening, when Mark was inside the cabin making dinner, Lily decided to confront the figure. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the flashlight and stepped off the porch, her feet crunching the dry leaves beneath her. She walked toward the woods, slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The light from the flashlight flickered as she moved deeper into the darkening forest, but the figure remained just at the edge of her vision. She took another step forward. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice unsteady but louder than she intended. The words felt strange in her mouth, as if she wasn't meant to speak them. Nothing answered. She took a few more steps, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the trees, but no matter how far she walked, the figure never got closer. It stood there, perfectly still, as if it was waiting for something. And then, something shifted in the air. The silence that had settled over the woods felt too thick, too heavy. Lily's chest tightened, and for the first time, she felt a deep, sinking sense of dread. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been alone for days. There was something wrong here, something wrong with this place. She turned and ran back to the cabin, the sound of her breath loud in her ears. Inside, Mark was waiting for her, concern etched across his face. "What's wrong?" he asked. Lily opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain it? How could she tell him that she had seen it again, that it was still out there, still watching, still waiting? "I'm just tired," she said, forcing a smile. "I think I need to sleep." Mark didn't press her further. But that night, as she lay in bed, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was close, closer than it had ever been. She could almost feel its presence in the dark, standing just outside the window, watching her, waiting. The days stretched on, and the family's peaceful retreat became something darker, something unsettling. They couldn't leave, there was nowhere else to go. The more Lily tried to ignore the figure, the more it seemed to creep into her thoughts, into her dreams. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think clearly. And with every passing day, she felt herself slipping further away from reality. Mark started to notice it too. He didn't see the figure, not exactly, but he began to act strangely. He'd wake in the middle of the night, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. He'd mumble about the figure, the thing in the woods, but then he'd forget. Just like Lily, he couldn't quite remember where the line between the real and the imagined had blurred. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Lily stood on the porch, staring out into the woods. There it was, at the edge of the trees. The figure, still as ever, watching her. Her heart pounded. She wanted to scream, to run, but something held her in place. And then, it moved. Just a little, just enough to make her blood run cold. The figure shifted, taking a step closer. Lily didn't wait to see more. She turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. She locked it and sat in the corner, clutching her knees to her chest. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She could feel the eyes on her, feel the figure closing in, step by agonizing step. The woods were no longer a peaceful place, no longer a retreat. They were a prison. And the figure, whatever it was coming for her. The widow's song. In the small coastal town of Haven's Edge, people spoke in hushed voices about the widow's song. It was the kind of tale passed from one generation to the next, a superstition rooted deep in the town's history. The song, they said, was a haunting melody that drifted up from the cliffs on foggy nights. The voice behind it was unmistakable, a mournful cry of a woman whose husband had been swallowed by the sea many years ago. It was on one such misty evening that Adam, a newcomer to the town, first heard the story. He'd come from the city, seeking a quieter life, and scoffed at the old tales. "Superstition," he muttered, taking a swig of his beer. "Nothing more." The locals, gray-faced and quiet, exchanged glances but didn't push him. They knew what happened to those who dismissed the widow's song. That evening, after the fog rolled in thick and heavy, Adam took a walk along the shore. The air was damp, and the salt stung his lips, but the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks brought him a strange peace. He felt at home, detached from the small-town superstitions. And then, just as the fog seemed to thicken, he heard it. A soft, haunting tune, barely a whisper on the wind. It was a melody he could not place, but it stirred something deep within him. A voice, thin and fragile, wove through the air like the thread of a delicate tapestry. It was beautiful but sorrowful. A woman's voice. His heart skipped. The song echoed through the mist, and Adam's steps slowed. He turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the fog, but there was nothing. The cliffs were empty, just jagged rocks and swirling mist. He shook his head and started walking again, dismissing the chill creeping up his spine as nerves. The wind howled, but the song followed him, threading through his thoughts. No matter how fast he walked, no matter how far he went, it never stopped. Over the next few days, Adam could not escape the song. It was in the wind. It followed him in his car. It hummed softly as he lay awake in his bed at night, the notes drifting like a memory he couldn't recall. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it filled his thoughts, a constant, nagging presence. He sought out the old fisherman, the one who had told him the tale of the widow's song. The man was sitting on a weathered bench, his face half hidden in shadows. "You hear it, don't you?" the fisherman asked, his eyes knowing. Adam nodded, unable to speak. The song had wrapped itself around him like a vice. "It's her," the fisherman said softly. "She never lets go of those who hear her song. Once it starts, it doesn't stop." Adam tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. He could still hear it, even now. The widow's song, sweet and sorrowful, echoing from the cliffs. The next morning, Adam was found by the shore, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sea. The song had finally taken him. The last chair. When the James family moved into the old house at the end of Willow Lane, they inherited more than just the weathered walls and dusty floors. The dining room came with a set of antique chairs, 5 matching and 1 odd. The chairs were carved with intricate designs, the wood dark and polished, their seats padded with faded velvet. They seemed the perfect set for the grand table that stretched out in the center of the room, but there was always one chair that stood apart. It was slightly larger than the rest, its carving more elaborate, as if it had been made for someone special. No matter how the chairs were arranged, this one chair always ended up at the head of the table. At first, the family didn't think much of it. It was an antique, after all. But over time, they began to notice something odd. Each night, when they sat for dinner, the odd chair seemed to have an undeniable pull. No matter where it was placed, it always seemed to find its way to the head of the table. And as soon as someone sat in it, a change seemed to come over them. It started with small things. Jack, the eldest son, began having strange dreams after sitting in the chair, dreams of a man he didn't recognize, a man who whispered his name. "You're the one who has to finish it," the man would say, his voice low and insistent. Jack would wake, drenched in sweat, the man's face lingering in his mind. Then it was Emma, the youngest daughter. One evening, she took the chair without thinking. That night, she dreamed of a house much like theirs, but different, ancient. She wandered its dark hallways, calling out for someone, but there was no answer. At the end of the hall, a door opened, and inside was a man. His face was blurry at first, but as she stared, it became clearer. It was the same man Jack had seen. Her voice trembled when she woke. "Who is he?" No one had an answer, but as the dreams grew more vivid, they began to feel real. The man from the dreams appeared in the house sometimes, when no one was looking. He was never seen directly, but his presence could be felt. The family grew uneasy, but none of them dared to stop sitting in the chair. As the days passed, the dreams grew darker. The man would appear at the foot of their beds, sometimes reaching out with cold hands, whispering words they could barely understand. "It must be finished," he would say. One night, the chair was moved to the head of the table once again, but this time, no one sat in it. No one dared. But when morning came, they found the chair empty, and the man was waiting for them in the shadows of the hallway. He was no longer a stranger.